Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Conversations in Black. Conversations in Black is a space facilitated by Musings from the Lighthouse that brings together Black artists and cultural custodians who demonstrate a commitment to the liberation of Black bodies. My name is Carla Felicia Scaife, and I am the founder of Musings from the Lighthouse. In this space, we are intentional about the way we communicate thoughts and ideas with one another. We intend for our language to be as accessible as possible by not allowing the specialized jargon of our individual disciplines to hinder clear communication. We demonstrate mutual respect for one another by being active listeners and offering thoughtful responses. We try our best to refrain from using ableist language or language that is not gender inclusive, and we affirm the right of anyone who participates to only discuss what they feel safe in offering to the conversation. Last week, we had some friends join in to help us grapple with the cost of truth telling in the context of correcting harmful narratives that are told of our history and of our bodies. We sought to find what keeps us from speaking up and telling the truth. We assess what we are risking and what we are gaining. We're grateful for your participation in that discussion last week. This week, it's just me. And in saying that, I feel obligated to start off with a confession. After our first talk that took place on last Thursday, I was in conversation with my friend Satoya, who also was a gracious contributor of last week's discussion. And I told her that though I was excited about continuing with these talks, I'm anxious about it. And so I explained to her that I was anxious about it because I was having trouble securing conversation partners that I felt would honor the sacredness of this space, who would really honor what we're trying to do, which is to create a safe space or create a space that is safe enough to show up in a way that is genuine and authentic so that those who join in from home can begin healing if they consent to going through that process. So in other words, we're just trying to create the right kind of conditions or set up the atmosphere so that something could happen if a person decides they are in agreement with that thing happening. And though I think that me trying to be particular about this thing is not something that I should be ashamed of, I do hold that intention with the fact that Satoya reminded me of, which is that how we think of safe space varies from person to person. And truly, I honor that. I really do. And none of us gets it right every time. I don't get it right most of the time, even with the best intentions. And so Erica, another conversation partner from last week, she said that it's impossible to do no harm, but we can at least try our best to do the least. And so I'm thinking about that, thinking about what she said. And I'm thinking about how our limitations or our inability to know fully sometimes causes harm unintentionally, inadvertently. And I know that we must all try to be accountable for the impact we have on each other. But in that dance we do with one another to make it right, we need something as a mediator between us. We need something that can reconnect us back to our senses when we are having trouble recognizing each other after harm has been done. In saying that, let me be quick to say that I am not advocating for maintaining physical or emotional proximity after a violation has occurred. Let me say that again. I am not advocating for maintaining physical or emotional proximity after a violation has occurred. You do not have to be in relationship with someone who harms you, even if they do it unintentionally. You have the right to determine who has access to you. So let me say that again. You do not have to be in relationship with someone who harms you, even if they do it unintentionally. You have the right to determine who has access to you. Now, I know that there are many situations where we cannot control who has access to us. For example, children can't control who has access to them. Those who experience domestic abuse are often not able to control who has access to them. Even in workplace situations, we don't always have the means to be able to limit access to ourselves. Mobility, especially in this economic climate, is a privilege. And it's a privilege that a lot of us don't have. We can't up and just move from one workplace to the next because it's not safe. A lot of us can't do that. So we recognize that and we honor that. But even though sometimes we end up in situations where our agency has been stripped away, it's still our right to limit who has access to us. And to have that agency denied us is violence, period. So let me say this again. I am not advocating for maintaining physical or emotional proximity after a violation has occurred. But what I'm advocating for is the freedom of each of our psyches to be able to maintain a perspective of humanity that validates the pain that we have experienced individually and as a collective, and also understands that the source of pain, when it's located in another person, points to the capacity each of us has to be broken. Why am I saying that? I'm saying that because there are systems in place that are strengthened by our collective brokenness. There are systems in place whose power is contingent upon our bodies being the sites of cyclical harm. And so we must always look for the origin of a harmful cycle. We must always ask who benefits from our pain, who benefits from our dysfunction, and who does. I'm glad you asked. The machine of empire is what benefits from our pain. The machine of empire is what benefits from our dysfunction. The machine that privileges some of us to get to the top and disenfranchises the rest of us. So we must always have those thoughts in our minds so as to keep from having perspectives that dehumanize us, that cause us to forget that we are a people who are constantly accosted by what is in place to keep us down. So that line of thinking is what undergirds how I have come to understand what radical acceptance is. What is radical acceptance? Radical acceptance is not something that enables or justifies or cosigns. It's not something that pacifies or ignores or dismisses or gaslights. But it also doesn't put down and it doesn't demonize or unfairly criticize. But rather, it is a perspective that allows one to bravely gaze upon a body and how that body has modified the space around them, and to do so without reframing that image into something that is more palatable for the ego to digest. And I find that it's extremely difficult to do that. It's extremely difficult to figure out how to do that without dishonoring our own selves and our own experiences and our own pain. But I also think that it's difficult to bravely gaze upon our own bodies and how we have modified the space around us without reframing what we see into something that our own egos can handle. So this evening, we want to talk about that process. We want to talk about examining our own selves without reframing what we see, without ignoring our flaws, and also without putting ourselves down. And we're going to talk about why going through that process is a radical act of resistance against systems of oppression, those systems that round up our bodies and force them into places we have not consented to occupying. And so this thing we're dealing with, we're going to name it as radical self-acceptance. And we're going to imagine radical self-acceptance as being something that is intentionally achieved through daily practice, and how intentionally practicing it every day moves it into the space of ritual, blending the profane with the sacred, and ultimately integrates all of the fragments of ourselves into something we are able to acknowledge as beautiful. I hope that's okay. But before we do that, let us take a moment to center ourselves. So if you would, take this time to be silent and take in a few deep breaths. Inhaling slowly, exhaling slowly. Inhaling slowly, exhaling slowly. As we continue breathing, let us remember our intentions, the worth of our bodies, and the power of our stories. Ashe. All right, let's get into it. So we have 5 questions to engage, and I think we want to stick with that format. Last week we had 5 questions, and I think 5 questions. I think that's enough to handle. Um, and if you have any thoughts, ideas, further questions, critiques, or if you need clarification on something, please feel free to leave a comment. Your voice matters, and we welcome the sound of it in this space. Okay. And our questions are as follows. Are you able to gaze upon your own body and the space around you that you have modified without reframing what you see? In other words, do you practice radical self acceptance? Second question. If not, what has kept you from being able to gaze upon your own body and how you have modified the space around you without reframing what you see? In other words, what has kept you from maintaining a posture of radical self acceptance? Third question. What does radical self acceptance look like in real time? Fourth question. How can radical self acceptance be ritualized? Fifth question. How is ritualized self acceptance a radical form of resistance? All right, so let's pose the first question again. Are you able to gaze upon your own body and the space around you that you have modified without reframing what you see? In other words, do you practice radical self acceptance? Do I practice radical self acceptance? So let me be vulnerable and answer the question. To be able to answer this question honestly, we have to first engage in radical self acknowledgement. What is radical self acknowledgement? Radical self acknowledgement is taking an honest assessment of where we are. It's being able to examine our behaviors, being able to identify any patterns that we notice. It's to ask ourselves what prompted our behaviors. It's thinking about what our bodies felt like before we acted. It's asking ourselves what we were trying to accomplish with our actions. Were we trying to solicit a response from someone? Were we trying to make ourselves feel better? Were we trying to be understood? Were we trying to get recognition? Were we trying to prove our worth? So in this context, we're asking ourselves, are we able to gaze upon our own bodies and the space around us that we have modified? Let me clarify that by saying the space around us that we have modified simply just means the impact that we've had on the people and the stuff around us. Okay. Are we able to look at ourselves and the consequences of our actions without making up a story about it that makes us feel better about ourselves or that does not condemn us to eternal damnation. I couldn't think of anything more dramatic than that. I'm sorry. Um, are we honest about where we are? Are we honest about the impact that we've had on others? Um, so, in doing this work, I find that for most of my personal history, I have not been able to do that. Um, for one, to be honest about what you see requires that you look in the first place. And it's absolutely terrifying to examine yourself. Um, to be honest about the impact that you've had on others requires that you listen to and validate others when they tell you how you've hurt them. That's difficult to do. How many of us are guilty of blaming people we've hurt by telling them that they were just sensitive or they misunderstood us? That's what we call gaslighting. Um, and I don't like to feel like the bad guy, but sometimes I am. Sometimes we are. And we will stay the bad guys unless we get honest about the roles that we've played in other people's lives. And that requires us to be able to be open enough to listen when somebody expresses that they've experienced harm from us. You know, harm doesn't always mean physical. Harm can be psychological. It could be emotional. You know. So what about y'all? Have you been able to engage with yourself and others in a way that is honest concerning where you are and what is taking place? Let's look and see. Anybody? I don't see any for now, but if you think of anything, uh, feel free to comment. So we're going to move to the second question. Okay, so if you haven't been able to be honest about it, what has kept you from being able to gaze upon your own body and how you have modified the space around you without reframing what you see? In other words, what has kept you from maintaining a posture of radical self acceptance? What has kept us from being able to look at ourselves and the consequences of our actions without making up a story about it that makes us feel better about ourselves? What keeps us from being honest about where we are and the impact that we've had on others? For me, I have an extremely difficult time dealing with the fact that I may have done something wrong. I also have an extremely difficult time dealing with the fact that I have flaws and that I'm not perfect. And so the reason that I have a difficult time with that is because being right, being perfect is tied to my sense of worth. Um, and so if I'm not careful, I can end up feeling like I'm not worth anything, like I'm not deserving of good things, like I'm not deserving of the space that I take up. And this happens when I associate the fact that I'm not always right and that I have flaws with what makes me worthy. And so that's why it's difficult for me to look. That's why it can be painful to look because that means I have to reckon with things that um, threaten my sense of worth or how I have been socialized to think of myself or measure my worth. Um, and you know, we live in a society where if people make mistakes, they get thrown away, they get canceled. And you know, when you do harm, there are consequences, and safety is something to consider always. But the problem is, most of our dysfunction is a result of systemic oppression. And rather than the focus be on eradicating those systems and rehabilitating our bodies that have suffered, we are gaslighted and treated as if our dysfunction exists in a vacuum. And so I think it's important to remember that we can remember that without enabling ourselves and other folks. We can remember that and still hold folks accountable. But that just means that we're going to have to collectively reimagine what accountability looks like. And that might be difficult, you know, it is difficult. Let's see. Johnny says, no, I haven't, due to the big elephant in the room called fear. Yes, fear. That's a big one. That has been one of my primary motivators as well. Thank you for that. But yeah, what about y'all? What keeps you from being able to maintain a posture of radical self-acceptance? What's at stake? What happens when you look at yourself, when you have to deal with the impact that you've had? And feel free to leave a comment if you would like. If not, you can just think about it. Oh, that's cool too. But anyway, while you're thinking about that, I'm going to go to the third question. What does radical self-acceptance look like in real time? Okay, so I do music, and it's extremely difficult to listen to my vocals during the editing process because I'm human and I sound like a human, and I often make mistakes, as humans do. And instead of beating myself up for being a human that sounds like a human that makes mistakes, if I'm going to be practicing radical self-acceptance in that situation, then I acknowledge that I am human and that I make mistakes. And I affirm myself by reminding myself that my worth is not contingent upon me being perfect. And I remind myself that I'm still worthy of taking up space, that I'm still worthy of creating, and that my art is still worthy. You know? Okay, so let's put this in a space of conflict. What does radical self-acceptance look like in real time in a space of conflict, interpersonal conflict? Okay, so let's say I've hurt you unintentionally, and then you let me know that I've hurt you, and you do so in a tone that I don't like, and it triggers me. Okay, what I do then, if I'm going to be practicing radical self-acceptance in real time, I'm going to take the time to breathe and affirm that my worth is still intact, though I've made a mistake that caused harm. I'm going to do that internally before, I begin communicating with you. I affirm that my worth is still intact, though I've made a mistake that caused harm. I'm still worthy of taking up space. I have not become disposable. So knowing that, with that in the front of my mind, I acknowledge to you that I've hurt you. I show remorse, and then I ask you how you would like to move forward, because it's not up to me, it's up to you, because you're the one that has been harmed. And so in doing that, I don't try to manipulate your response, but I allow you to assess whether or not you think it's safe to remain in community with me. And that's difficult to do, especially if you're like me and you have abandonment issues. It can be difficult to allow someone the space to assess whether or not it's safe to still be in community with you. Very difficult. But anyway, so if you decide that you would like to remain in community with me, I thank you, and I express a commitment to not engaging in the behavior that caused the harm in the first place. And if you decide that you would not like to remain in community with me, I respect you by not trying to push your boundaries and by not trying to make you think that you're overreacting for the decision that you made. And I still express a commitment to not engaging in the behavior that caused harm. That's tough. That's real tough. Let's see. Johnny says, accepting flaws in some cases abominable when you come from a society that pressures you into perfection, and if you fall short of that, you are shamed. Self-guilt onto your crown, which shifts your mental state into fight or flight. Yes, fight or flight. Yes, snaps for that one. Thank you. So anybody else? What does radical self-acceptance look like in real time? Can you think of a situation maybe in the past where you did not, you know, go through that process, but you can reimagine what it should look like? Or can you imagine a new situation where you can think of like how that can be practiced? Um, so anyway, we're going to move to the fourth question. How can radical self-acceptance be ritualized? I would say that the answer is simple. Um, Maybe not simple to do, but the answer itself is simple. Um, and you have to do three things. I think you have to do three things. And your way of doing things might be different, but this is what made sense to me, so I wrote it down. First, you have to decide that radical self-acceptance is the posture that you would like to have. So you have to make that decision. Then secondly, to maintain that posture, you have to be intentional about what you're trying to do. Determine what your desired outcome is. Okay. Thirdly, you have to commit to the process. So if you can, every time a situation arises where you feel tempted to reframe something about yourself or something concerning your impact on others, you have the opportunity to do differently, to be intentional about affirming in you whatever needs to be affirmed so that you can be honest and do the least harm. So let me say that again. Every time a situation comes up where you feel tempted to reframe something about yourself or something concerning your impact on others, which usually involves either gaslighting yourself or somebody else, you have the opportunity to do differently, to be intentional about affirming in you whatever needs to be affirmed so that you can be honest and do the least harm. Okay. I wonder if anybody has anything to add to that. I would hope so. I hope that's going to be something that we'll be thinking about. Okay. Okay. We're going to, let's see, I think we have another comment. Self-acceptance in conflict seems harder with people that aren't doing that work themselves. Definitely, definitely. It's extremely difficult. And I don't have I guess I don't have any thoughts on how to make that easier. Not right now. It's not something I thought about, but that's definitely something that we'll have to be thinking about, you know. So thank you for bringing that up. Let's see. Let's move on to the last question. Okay. How is ritualized radical self-acceptance a radical form of resistance? Well, in my humble opinion, it's a form of resistance because it helps us to stay connected to our humanity in the face of systems that dehumanize us, that make us think that what makes us human is why we're oppressed. Let me say that again. It's a form of resistance because it helps us to stay connected to our humanity in the face of systems that dehumanize us and make us think that what makes us human is why we're oppressed. It's a form of resistance because it sets us up to fall in love with ourselves, to move about with a conscience that remembers that our circumstances, our trauma, does not make us less than. Because when we remember who we are, that we are not less than, we are then empowered to demand more than what has been given to us. We are empowered to take what is owed to us. Again, when we remember who we are, that we are not less than, we are then empowered to demand more than what has been given to us. We are empowered to take what is owed us. So that's what it's all about, I think. It's about remembering who we are. It's about being who we are, because who we are is enough. And who we are deserves better than what we have. And that's it, y'all. Does anybody have any final thoughts? I'll give you a couple moments for anybody to say anything if they want. Let's see. If not, let's see. I think the ritualization of self-acceptance is important because it's something that I have to make a habit out of, which means I need to work at being present. Oh yes, being present. That's really hard. It's really difficult. For me, I think that the pandemic has forced me to be present because I can't even imagine, being elsewhere. But I know this pandemic has affected all of us in different ways. I had a really difficult time being present until now, but I just feel like I can't think about more than 2 days from now without being overwhelmed. But at the same time, that does not mean that I'm actually present. It just might just mean that I just can't think about what's happening 2 days from now. Let's see. Systems that attempt to influence us to believe that we are less than human. Yes, yes, they dehumanize us. And the point is to remember that we are human. And as humans, we do human stuff and we're allowed to do human stuff. And, we have to hold ourselves accountable, but also not dog ourselves. All right. All right. Well, I appreciate you all participating in this discussion, this short discussion. If you know someone who you think needs to hear what we've talked about, feel free to hit that share button. And also don't forget to like and follow our page, Musings from the Lighthouse. And we'll be back next week. We won't be back on Thursday, but we'll be back on Wednesday at 7 p.m. Central Time, 8 p.m. Eastern Time. All right. Thank you so much.